If you are into tabletop role-playing games, you might have heard that it's possible to play them without a game master. But how? How do you play something that's essentially made for collaborative storytelling all by yourself? Over the last 6 months, I've played a lot of solo RPGs. And in my opinion, there are 3 main ways you can approach playing them. What I want to do today is I want to create an adventure seed and then walk you through all 3 methods. I want to show you their strengths and their weaknesses and how each of them helps you create a unique and interesting story. A couple of weeks ago, I was reading The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie, and it gave me an idea. In the book, we read about Logan, who barely manages to escape an ambush by a group called the Shankar. We learn that they killed his family, his wife, his son, and now, presumably, his entire warband. We learn that he can talk to the spirits, and we learn that Bias, a magus in the south, is looking for him. Since Logan is lacking any real purpose right now, he decides that meeting this person is better than waiting for death. On his way, he meets Malakus Kai, who is apprenticed to Bias and has come to guide him. And that's where we will start our story, with Logan as our main character. With this little exercise, we've already created 2 important elements of any story: a status quo and a desire. It also shows that you don't need any fancy material to start playing. You can literally pick up a book you like, a TV show you love, or any idea in your head and go from there. But we need one more thing to make a good story. And this is where our 3 methods come in. Let's zoom out and look at method number 1. We take our characters and place them on a very simple hex map. We start here, and we need to go there. To make this interesting, we apply pressure. When we apply pressure to something, we get a reaction. If we push someone, they fall. If we corner an animal, it bites. And if we pressure our character, it forces them to make decisions. And that's how we create conflict. So how does this look like when we are playing without a game master? For this example, I'll be using Kal Arath, which is a very popular OSR game designed to be played without a GM. To move from one hex to the next, we follow a set procedure. We roll for weather, we roll for getting lost, which is very unlikely since we have a guide, so we roll with advantage. We roll for a point of interest and get an outpost settlement filled with only corpses. Then we roll for an encounter and meet angered mystics. Now, you might be thinking that this feels very procedural, and you'd be right. If we just cycle through these prompts, we run the danger of getting stuck in a very boring loop. But maybe these angered mystics are somehow connected to the Magi. Maybe this wasn't the only settlement filled with corpses, and this is why Bias is looking for you in the first place. How you interpret these prompts is very much up to you, the context of your story, and the themes you want to explore. It's your job and the creative exercise of these types of games to connect the dots and make your choices meaningful. The strength of this method is that it's easy to follow and very setting specific. You can play sword and sorcery like Kal Arath or a post-apocalyptic world like Merkborg. While there are fine differences, the general loop will feel very familiar. And this approach isn't limited to OSR games either. In a journaling game like A 1,000-Year-Old Vampire, you roll for a prompt and you use that as the content of the scene, making decisions based on your character. For example, a catastrophic event is happening in the city you are currently staying in. You get to be the hero for one day. How are you helping? The downside of this method is that the conflict is very external. And it can sometimes feel like our choices don't matter in the long run. Regardless of what we do, if we move towards the next hex, we still follow the same procedure. Of course, we should take care that the story we tell is cohesive and influenced by our decisions, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. And it stands in stark contrast to our next method. We start again with Logan and Malachus Kai, leaving their camp to meet Bias, first of the Magi. This time, instead of generating conflict through random encounters and procedural game loops, we trigger a move. And that move is follow a path. If you are familiar with Ironsworn or other games powered by the apocalypse, this might already sound very familiar. For everyone else, let me explain what a move is. At the heart of a move is an action. Our character wants to do something. In a more traditional RPG, we might roll a d20 and see if they succeed. If they do, great, the story goes on. But if they fail at a critical moment, we usually rely on the GM to drive the story forward. And that's not great for solo play. Instead, we add another layer to the action, the why. Why is our character doing this? What's at stake? What's the danger? When we ask these questions, the focus of the resolution shifts. Instead of task resolution, we use conflict resolution to drive the story. But let's apply the story example. Why is Logan going to meet Bias? He's looking for purpose. What's the danger? Could they get lost? Very unlikely since they have a guide. But bandits? I mean, what fantasy story doesn't have bandits? Now let's look at the move. On a strong hit, we reach our destination. Very simple. On a weak hit, we reach our destination but face a complication. On a miss, we are waylaid by a significant threat. Notice how it doesn't say we fail. A weak hit could mean we notice a bandit camp in the distance but have time to react. It could mean the path is obstructed and we have to take a longer, more dangerous route. It could mean that when we arrive at the library, there's an enemy army camped outside and we need to figure out how to get past them. All of these could also be the result of a miss. What I tend to do is I soften the complication on a weak hit and give my characters time to react, while a miss has more immediate consequences, like being ambushed by bandits who are actively looking for Logan. And that's the difference between a soft move and a hard move. The outcome of the move pushes the story forward by introducing narrative complications instead of stopping us at a failed task. Regardless of the outcome, it should, in a way, always make sense. A brawny barbarian probably wouldn't understand complicated magic texts, even on a strong hit. But that would make a perfect result for a weak hit. You find something, but there's a complication. Because I struggled with this, and I still struggle with this, let's look at some examples. If you've read the book we used as our story seed, you know that Logan and Malachus Kai get into a fight with bandits. How does that look like? In a cinematic game like Ironsworn, the outcome of this fight is resolved through moves as well, rather than slowly chipping away at hit points. But first we ask ourselves, what's our goal? Are we trying to run away, capture, or kill them? What's at stake? Let's assume the worst and say we roll a miss. We could say Logan gets killed, but that's a rather boring outcome. So instead, we introduce a narrative complication. Maybe we manage to kill them, but as we are rushing to cut down the last remaining archer, they loosen an arrow. We manage to avoid it and cut down our enemy, but as we turn around, we see Malachus Kai lying on the ground, an arrow stuck in his chest. Now, technically the move says on a miss, we are defeated or our objective is lost. And this outcome doesn't strictly fit that description. But we've lost our guide, and the apprentice of the magus who was looking for us is dead. I'd argue our journey just became a lot more complicated. But let's look at a more literal interpretation of the move. Maybe our goal was to kill the bandits, but they escape and get help from a nearby warband. Now we're being chased. Or they actually capture us and threaten to kill Malachus unless we do something for them. All of these are valid outcomes that lead to interesting and very different story developments. Which one you choose depends on your preferences and the context of your story. But let's look at one more example. We are interrogating one of the bandits we've captured and learn that they are part of a larger warband that is pillaging surrounding villages. We are looking for information about their whereabouts so that we might stop them somehow. On a weak hit, we learn information, but something complicates it. Maybe they are actually a pretty big warband, or for some reason sponsored by a neighboring noble that wants to weaken his enemies. On a miss, it doesn't mean we learn nothing. It means what we learn is really, really bad narratively. Maybe they're actually only a couple of hours behind and are heading to the library to kill Bias. Maybe we learn the name of their leader, and it's a name that is very familiar to Lone. It's the name of his dead son. Could it be him? Using a character's backstory against them or forcing them to make choices that go against their morals is always a strong and valid complication, especially on a miss. The biggest difficulty with this method is that it's less intuitive if you come from a traditional RPG background. There's a very steep learning curve, in my opinion. One important rule is this: if you can think of a meaningful danger or complication, if nothing is at stake, you probably shouldn't trigger a move. But don't worry about getting it wrong. Games like Ironsworn come with tons of inspiration, and the most important thing is not being too hard on yourself and going with your gut. Task resolution and conflict resolution do have something in common, though. They're both very much rooted in fiction. You imagine what your character does in the scene, and then decide if a role is appropriate and which stat you choose. If you do it the other way around and look at your character sheet and mechanics first, and let them dictate your choices, I don't think you will enjoy this style of play. The fiction should always come first. Embracing weak hits and misses is what creates conflict, and if you learn to lean into that, you get much more interesting and unique stories. At this point, you might be wondering, what about a Game Master emulator like Mythic? This works a bit different, but it still creates conflict. When we start a story, we usually have some idea of where it's going. I personally think a lot about the next few story beats between sessions. It's kind of inevitable. And it's those expectations that we use to generate surprises. But before we start rolling dice, we have to do a bit of preparation. We create two lists. The first is a list of NPCs, which can include characters, locations, or objects. We add Malachus Kai, Bias, the Shankar, Logan's Warband, the library, and, if you've read the book, Logan's Frying Pan. Basically, anything we find interesting and we want to reappear in the story. Then we create a list of threats, our goals, basically. For now, we just have one. Meet Bias, first of the Magi. Next, we ask ourselves what the next scene should be based on where we're starting. If we want to explore the journey, that's our expected scene. If we want to move a bit faster, we could jump ahead and say Logan has already met Bias and they're now in the capital meeting the king. Either way, the GM emulator checks that expectation. In Mythic, we roll a d10 against a chaos factor. And depending on the result, the expected scene either happens, is altered, or is interrupted. The chaos factor represents how much control we have over the story. The less control, the higher the chaos, and the more likely our expectations are changed. If a scene happens as expected, we play it out. If we are unsure about details, we fill them in using random tables or yes or no questions. If a scene is altered, something within changes. Usually, that means the next expected thing happens. If a scene is interrupted, something else happens instead. And that interruption has a focus. It could be something like PC negative, NPC positive, or something that moves us towards our threat or away from it. And that's why our lists matter. Depending on the focus, we roll on them to introduce relevant elements. Let's look at our example. While it is entirely possible to move the plot along further, it should be reasonable in regards to our current threat list. Yes, I can say Bias and Logan are meeting the king, but I have no context. What would that even look like? What would be our motivation? Instead, I think the next expected scene is Logan and Malachus Kai arriving at the library and being greeted by an entourage. If I roll an altered scene, maybe Bias himself greets us, or maybe the gates aren't guarded at all. Both are small twists on my expectations. An interrupt is more dramatic. Let's say for focus, I roll move towards a threat. The only threat I have is meet Bias, first of the Magi. To get a better idea of what that means, I roll on one of the many random tables the Mythic GME provides, more specifically, the action and meaning table. I get revenge and environment. The first thing I'm thinking is that the only way I can move towards meeting Bias is to actually meet him in this scene. And it's actually the random prompts from our very first example that give me an idea. I think that he is looking for some mystics that have poisoned the environment, causing the destruction of a few villages in proximity of his library. We meet him on his way and he asks us for our help. But there's one more way we can create these interrupts. I think we follow Bias on his way to one of those villages, and I think that will be my next expected scene. First off, I can use the random tables to get a sense of what it looks like, but I actually already have some sort of image in my mind. I'm envisioning this village that can maybe hold a couple of hundred people, and there's some sort of shadow cast over it. It's ripping through the houses and the streets like there was some sort of explosion at the center of it. Whatever pops into my head as a possibility, or if I'm torn between two equally interesting options, I can ask, is this happening? Yes or no? In Mythic, this is resolved by rolling a d100. And when we roll doubles like a 22 or 23, and it's lower than our chaos factor, we trigger a random event, which is essentially the same as an interrupt. Let's say I roll a yes. That's how it looks like, but I also trigger a random event with a focus of NPC negative. I roll on my NPC list and roll Malachus Kai. I actually already have an idea and decide not to roll on any additional tables. So our group carefully moves through the village looking for survivors when I hear a scream. Logan turns around and sees a mad, zombie-like villager attacking the apprentice. What does he do? Whatever happens, I use either my RPG system of choice to resolve this or simply ask yes or no questions. So Logan draws a sword and rushes towards his new comrade to help him. Is he successful? Yes or no? This method is very similar to method 1 as it introduces random elements into my scene that my character needs to handle. But there's a reason why I think it deserves its own place. What this method does more than any other is it ensures that elements I find interesting get reintroduced throughout my story. It always refers back to my lists, so while it seems random, there is a sense of continuity and progress. I could have rolled up the Shankar or even Logan's warband as the focus of a scene. How would that have looked like? I think one problem people have is that it seems complicated. And it's certainly possible to overthink these things and get stuck on a roll. When that happens, you should feel free to ignore the emulator and go with what you think is fun or whatever pops into your head. Maybe you roll NPC negative and you roll on an action and meaning table, and an idea pops into your head that has absolutely nothing to do with those words. Go with that. Maybe the idea you get has nothing to do with NPC negative, but would make an interesting complication for your character instead. Go with that. The point of these events is not to police your game, but to give you new ideas and interesting developments that you wouldn't have thought of otherwise. The point is to surprise yourself. Now that's a lot, I think. So let's recap a little bit. Our goal when playing without a game master is to introduce conflict in our game to create an interesting plot. We can do that with a procedural generation of random elements. They are easy to follow, setting specific, but require a bit of creative thinking to avoid falling into a boring loop. B, we can drive the story through our actions and introduce complication based on the results. This has a learning curve and requires us to think about possible dangers and stakes, while at the same time make our actions seem more meaningful. And C, we introduce random elements based on our expectations of how the story should develop, and while being similar to method 1, it puts an emphasis on relevant plot elements like our threats, our characters, and relevant NPCs. Of course, you can mix and match these methods as well. You can use different prompts to establish pressure in the scene, use moves to resolve them, and trigger random events when asking questions. Though I do recommend giving each option a try before you do that. Regardless of the method you choose, they do have something in common. At some point, you will have to establish some sort of scene which you can play out. And while that can be a video by itself, I think not giving at least a few ideas on how to handle that is not in the spirit of this video. When establishing a scene, I recommend 2 things. Establish where your character is, who is present, what is happening, and depending on the context, the motivation of the individual characters present. The second thing I like to do is I like to engage my character's senses. What are they seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, or feeling? It doesn't have to be very detailed, but just enough to maybe evoke some sort of emotion or mental image. Since we are playing by ourselves, I feel using this increases my immersion and helps flesh out the scene if I'm a little stuck. Using any of these methods will give you a good starting point to play solo RPGs. However, this is usually a way to create your own adventure style of play. It's, in one way or another, emergent storytelling. If you want to play a published adventure instead, I made a video about different methods I use to play a published D&D adventure by myself. If you would rather start with one of the methods I just described, I also made a video about 10 solo RPGs that you can try for free. I really hope you liked this video. I tried to put everything I know about solo RPGs in here as condensed and as clear as possible. And all that's really left for you is to start playing and making your own experiences. Because nothing beats actually playing. See you next time.